Snow lay heavy across the prairie that winter, a silence so deep it seemed even the crows dared not break it. The fences leaned with ice, brittle wood groaning when the wind swept down from the ridge. Jedediah McGraw stood at his gate, scarf pulled high against his jaw, eyes narrowing at the ranch that had grown emptier by the season. Once he'd dreamed of this land yielding him plenty, cattle grazing fat and steady, barns stacked high with hay. Now it was a place of hunger and quiet failure, a patch of earth where even hope seemed to have frozen solid. He needed help, needed someone to keep the ranch alive. And when desperation gnawed deeper than pride, he wrote to an agency in Kansas, requesting a bride. He told himself it was practical. A woman could cook, mend, tend the hearth, and with her dowry maybe the ranch could last through the storm. But his heart was not stirred by romance. It was the cold calculation of a man drowning who would cling to any piece of driftwood. The carriage rattled into town beneath a gray sky, wheels cracking over frozen mud. Townsfolk gathered, as they always did when news was scarce and a fresh arrival offered gossip for the weeks to come. Clara Boone stood with her arms crossed, her sharp mouth ready. When Temperance Calloway stepped down from the carriage, her boots sinking into the slush, there was an audible intake of breath. She was large, broad-shouldered, wide-hipped, a woman who filled her heavy coat as if it were stitched too small. Her cheeks burned from the cold, strands of hair escaping from her bonnet, and yet she moved carefully, politely, thanking the driver with a voice clear but low. Jed's heart sank at once. This was not the bride he'd pictured, not the sturdy but slim woman of practicality his imagination had fashioned. Shame twisted inside him as whispers rippled through the crowd. Poor Jed taking on a burden, Clara muttered loud enough for ears to catch. That ranch'll sink for sure now. Laughter answered her. Temperance lowered her gaze, though the slightest quiver of her lips betrayed that she'd heard. She did not argue, did not snap back. Instead, she placed her gloved hand firmly on the railing and steadied herself as she stepped clear of the carriage, her dignity quiet but intact. Jed approached, his boots crunching on ice. He tipped his hat without meeting her eyes, mumbled her name, then offered his arm stiffly. She took it with care, and together they walked past the murmurs and stares toward the chapel. The wedding was brief, a handful of words spoken beneath the dim glow of lantern light. Pastor Elijah Tate, with his worn Bible and gentle tone, did what he could to lend warmth, but there was no cheer. No applause followed the vows. Jed answered in a voice stripped bare of affection. Temperance answered with steadiness, though her hands trembled faintly at the edges of her woolen sleeves. When it was done, they rode out to the ranch in silence, the sleigh bell muffled by snow, two strangers bound by necessity rather than desire. Life began without tenderness. Jed rose each morning before dawn, throwing himself into the work of feeding thin cattle and repairing fences weighed down by ice. Temperance stayed in the house, cooking meals, mending worn shirts, patching the holes in blankets. They shared a table, yet not conversation. When Jed spoke, it was practical, brusque instructions or brief acknowledgments. She answered softly, never pressing further. At night, the fire crackled between them, but its warmth seemed a wall rather than a bridge. Jed told himself this was all he needed. Survival, not sentiment. Yet something about her silence pressed against him, heavier than the winter night. It was her strength he noticed first, though grudgingly. He came in one morning, frost on his lashes, and saw her hauling 2 buckets of water across the frozen yard. The handles dug into her hands, her breath puffing in clouds, but she never asked for help, never complained. Another evening, he found his old coat, torn at the sleeve, neatly patched with fine, careful stitches. She'd left it on the chair by the fire without a word. He muttered thanks, though she was already busy at the stove, ladling stew into bowls that steamed against the chill. Trips into town were a trial. Clara Boone's tongue sharpened with each visit, her voice pitched to be overheard. Look at her, slower than a mule in spring. Jed's got his hands full with that one. Laughter rustled like dry grass behind her words. Jed's jaw tightened, shame curling in his chest, but he never defended his wife. Instead, he walked ahead, pretending not to hear, leaving Temperance to endure the sting alone. She bore it with lowered eyes, though afterward her silence grew heavier, her shoulders straighter, as if she had folded the pain into herself. Not all in town were cruel. May Caldwell once praised the bread Temperance had baked, saying it reminded her of home before her husband passed. That kindness, though small, lit a glimmer in Temperance's eyes that Jed could not ignore. But gossip carried farther than kindness, and when Jed overheard men call him desperate, saying he had married the ranch, not the woman, shame burned hotter than fire. He turned it into coldness, withdrawing further, unable to meet her gaze for fear she might see the truth of his discontent. Then the storm came. The blizzard swept down from the mountains, howling against the ranch walls, rattling shutters, driving snow beneath the door. When Jed's horse bolted from the barn, he cursed and went after it, coat flapping, boots sinking into drifts. Hours passed, and when he returned, empty-handed, his anger thickened. Yet before dawn broke, he heard a door creak. Through the window he saw her trudging across the snow, skirts whipped by wind, lantern swinging in her hand. She followed the tracks, found the horse tangled in wire near the creek, its flanks steaming with panic. With numb fingers she freed it, her palms cut, her arms straining as she led the trembling beast back through the storm. Jed met her at the barn door, astonishment rooted in his chest. Blood marked her hands, crimson against white snow. But she said nothing, only tied the horse safely inside and leaned her head against its neck with a weary breath. Something shifted then. For the first time, Jed saw more than her body, more than the whispers of townfolk. He saw a woman who had faced the storm without flinching, who had risked her strength for what was his. Later, by the fire, he cleaned and wrapped her wounds, their hands brushing, silence thick but no longer hostile. When she finally drifted to sleep, he lay awake beside the crackling logs, staring at the beams overhead, unsettled by a new and unfamiliar feeling, respect, perhaps even gratitude. It was not love, not yet, but it was a crack in the wall that had kept them apart, a shift that made the long winter seem a little less endless. And as the wind outside howled like a chorus of ghosts, Jed realized that what he thought he had married for was not what might save him after all. The weeks that followed pressed down with a hunger sharper than the cold. Snow lay deep in the gullies. Cattle bawled in their stalls with ribs showing through hide, and Jed knew the ranch's bones were close to breaking. He counted feed sacks in the barn, felt the lightness of the grain, and cursed the winter under his breath. Yet it was Temperance who looked at the shelves, measured with her eye, and spoke with a calm Jed had never heard from her before. "We can stretch what we have," she said, setting beans in water to soak. She boiled broth from bones he would have thrown away, lined boots with scraps of cloth she salvaged, found use where Jed only saw loss. He watched her work by lamplight, sleeves rolled, hair damp with steam, and something inside him shifted again. Her size, once to his eyes only a mark of shame, became a presence of strength, like an oak standing through storm. Nights carried a different weight. When he returned from tending cattle, the smell of bread drifted through the cabin, low humming carried with it, soft and steady, like a lullaby for the weary. He would pause at the door, reluctant to break the moment, the sound reminding him of a life he had long forgotten could exist in a place so barren. One evening she laughed, an unguarded sound, when Flower puffed up from the table, dusting her hair white. For the first time since their vows, Jed laughed too, though quickly as if afraid of it. But the echo of that sound lingered in him long after. In town, gossip tightened its hold. Clara Boone wasted no chance to spit venom, her voice sharp as ice on glass. "Your wife's more burden than bride, Jedediah," she sneered across the mercantile counter, eyes darting to those listening. He burned with humiliation, every gaze in the room piercing him, his throat clenched, words withering before they could rise. He turned away, silent, leaving Temperance to endure the sting alone once more. Her face showed no anger, no reproach, but later at the supper table her silence seemed heavier than any storm. Pastor Tate, who had witnessed the cruelty, laid a hand on Jed's shoulder outside the church. "A man's worth," he said quietly, "isn't weighed by what people whisper, but by how he shields the hearts entrusted to him." The words lingered like coals in Jed's chest, too hot to ignore, too sharp to cast aside. Then the storm came unlike any before. Winds screamed through the valley, lifting snow in wild swirls, burying fence lines. Jed heard the barn groan, timbers cracking beneath the weight of snow. Panic drove him out into the blizzard, lantern flame flailing as the roof sagged. Cattle pressed against the walls, eyes wide with terror. He pushed at the beams, his hands raw with effort, but the weight was too much. Then she was there, staggering through the storm, skirts whipping like sails, breath tearing white from her lungs. Without hesitation, Temperance shouldered against the fallen timber, her body straining, arms trembling, voice breaking in grunts of effort. Together, side by side, they forced the beam enough for the cattle to stumble free. hooves crashing into snow. When the last steer bolted into the night, the roof came down in a thunder of wood and ice. Temperance fell with it, crumpling into the drift. Jed hauled her up, her face pale, lips tinged blue. Her hands were torn, her dress ripped, frost clinging to her lashes. He dragged her back to the cabin, laid her by the fire, wrapped her in blankets, and with trembling fingers warmed her frozen hands in his. He whispered her name, first with fear, then with something far deeper. Watching her chest rise and fall, fragile yet stubborn, he felt shame pierce him sharper than the cold ever could. All winter he had seen her as burden, and all winter she had been the strength that held the ranch together. By morning, word had traveled. A Caldwell brought broth, and when townsfolk came to see the wreck of the barn, they heard what had happened. For once, Clara Boone's tongue faltered, words dying when faced with the truth of Temperance's courage. That woman saved his herd, May said firmly, voice carrying across the yard, and no one dared argue. That evening, Jed sat across from his wife at the table. The lamplight softened her weary face, the lines of exhaustion etched deep, yet her eyes lifted to his with quiet steadiness. He reached out then, hand calloused, rough, and laid it over hers. No words passed his lips, but the gesture was more than speech. In that silence, something new rooted itself between them, fragile but alive. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the ruins of the barn, softening jagged edges. Inside, the cabin held warmth it had not known before. Jed realized that love did not always come with thunder or fire. Sometimes it arrived like snow, quiet, steady, reshaping the world without a sound. He saw her not as burden, but as the very marrow of survival, the proof that dignity and grace often wear plain faces and weather heavy bodies. She had surprised him like never before, not with beauty as the world measured it, but with the unyielding strength of her spirit. And so, as an old soul looking back might tell you, the lesson lay not in the land he nearly lost, nor in the whispers that had mocked him, but in the quiet endurance of the woman beside him. In the brittle winters of our lives, it is not pride that saves us, but kindness, not judgment, but grace. If this tale has left a spark in your heart, carry it with you through your own storms and subscribe to Wild West Tales, where the stories of forgotten lives still burn with truth and warmth.